Looks like that's working out. So let's make sure that's going well. Does everybody see that? Let's see, going back to the channel. Yep, we're good. All right, cool. Let's dive right in since we're late. Hello, everybody. My name is Dan Felder. We'll be talking about what that is. So I am talking about creating nonlinear strategy in TCGs. With this talk, I have, because I like puns, called Wrecking the Curve. So when I say TCGs, in reality, this term has been fragmented heavily. What I mean is games like Magic the Gathering, Hearthstone, Yu-Gi-Oh, all that type of stuff. So often there is no trading in this trading card game these days, especially digital. So we call them collectible card games, I've heard, but TCG has also been used for collectible character games. Some people call them card battlers. They're trying to take that over. But the point is, when I say TCG, most people know I mean, stuff like Magic the Gathering. So I often use that. Even though it's often like living card games, expandable card games, the point is you take cards, you shuffle them together, you have nothing on the board at the start or very little things on the board at the start, and you build up as you play. So that's what we're talking about. So who the heck am I? Well, my name is Dan Felder. I have worked on a bunch of card games and other turn-based games. Some card games specifically I've worked on are Faeria, Hearthstone, several expansions, not the core game, Warhammer Quest, the adventure card game, and a bunch of secret stuff that I cannot talk about and I hope will come out someday. Done a lot of consulting work, done a lot of individual projects and so on, and I've worked on way, way more turn-based games, strategy games, including action games. I love strategy. Formerly, I've worked at Electronic Arts, Blizzard, Abercam, and FFG, only as an intern, but it was a lot of fun. So, what is Magic the Gathering? What is a TCG? Where did this all get started? Richard Garfield was asked a long time ago to create a game that could be played between role-playing games. That's what the original Wizards of the Coast wanted to do. They wanted a game that people could play between role-playing game sessions. They were originally trying to make role-playing game supplements, and they wanted something that could be made between that. He was pitching them Robo Rally, which came out later. They said, this is too expensive for us to make, but I could do something with cards. I know a lot of artists. Could we make a short game that fits between them? And so what happened there, which was really interesting, was he basically turned this into this game where he said, what if there was a game that was bigger than the box? What if there was a game that when you opened it, you got different pieces than other people did? That would work well with card games. And the game he created became Magic the Gathering, which spawned a gigantic genre, and Magic has been evolving and changing and growing over the last almost 30 years at this point. So it is a wealth of interesting game design knowledge, and is one of the reasons I'm a game designer today. I love Magic the Gathering. It got me into the genre, and I have gone very deep into what makes this game tick and what these lessons are that can apply to other games. So, what makes card games tick? Excellent question. It's the economy, stupid. I'm going to be simplifying things. We are not going to be able to unpack everything that is this gigantic genre, but the core of what makes a card game work is its economy. And if you change the economy in card games, you get massive, massive ripple effects. One reason Magic is such a definitive game is because its economy was so far ahead of its time. So, mana systems, economies, and systems create what I like to call the structure of fun. This structure of fun is a concept that I've taken from actually my background as in writing in story structure. There are certain structures that make a good story, and what is a story if not a game that you don't get to play yourself? Games are about creating human experiences. Throughout all of human history, we've had this deep desire to have incredible experiences beyond our normal daily life. And for the longest time, we said, look, I can't give you an amazing experience, but I can tell you about someone else that had a cool experience. I'll tell you about Luke Skywalker. I'll get you to empathize with him, and I will, through that, give you a vicarious adventure. Games just say, hey, what if we just gave you the adventure? Games are not storytelling, they are story living, effectively. Games are stories you live. And what's interesting is that we know throughout how human psychology works that there are certain types of human experiences that we like better than others, we find more exciting or positive than others. And what game economies tend to do is try to create that these stories happen organically. And the game economies create that very effectively. So what's this amazing structure of fun that I use in all my game design? It's this. I spent all this time building out this diagram, and I hope you guys really appreciate it. The core idea is escalating, alternating positives and negatives. Think of yourself in a game as the protagonist. if a really boring story is when you just something good happens to you, then another good thing happens, then another good thing happens, then another good thing happens. This isn't interesting. What we want is humans live off of contrast. After a really awesome good thing, we want to have a really big negative experience. Well, we don't want that, but story writers want that. We don't want to have just a string of endless defeats, a string of endless sorrows. This is what creates a tragedy into comedy often. Like, endlessly negative things become hilarious. People lose the ability to care and they just start laughing because they have nothing left. So great story structure is often built on this idea of alternating positives and negatives. Good thing happens, then a bad thing, then a good thing, then a bad thing. But it also needs to escalate. Here's a really boring story. A person is promoted at work. Then that makes him arrogant, so he is. Then his manager decides he can't actually handle it, so he's demoted back to his previous job. He gets humble, he decides he wants to change his perspectives, and so he is promoted again to his original job. Then, however, the company starts running into troubles, and he makes some mistakes, and he is demoted again to his original job. This is a boring story. It's not going anywhere. On the other hand, let's say we have some escalation here. The guy's promoted, then he discovers some weird stuff in the company and he asks about it, and looks like it's some inconsistent accounting, and he is suddenly fired for looking into this. He went from a job to a promotion to fired, worse than where he started. That's interesting. Now he goes to a journalist and with some of his findings and tell him that he looked into something and weird stuff's going on. And now he is hired as a journalist to work with this guy. It turns out he's always wanted to be a journalist. He's been doing this dead-end accounting job, and he wanted to go into this. Now he's in a better job. He's in his dream job than he originally started. But now it turns out the company is framing him for the inconsistencies, and that's why he was fired. And so now he might be going to jail. So you see, this story is building. You can feel in your gut it's a better story. Alternating, escalating positives and negatives. Alternating for the emotional impact, escalating so that we feel like we're going somewhere, and the new escalation contracts the previous one. This is why you don't, even though the Death Star attack in A New Hope is one of the most exciting and fun moments in the entire movie, you don't just have 2 hours of that. You have to build and get contrasts to it. You can't just do a 2-hour climax. So, Hearthstone has mechanics that directly build a brilliant structure of fun. So this right here is called your mana. On turn 1, you have 1 mana. On turn 2, you have 2. On turn 3, you have 3. Mana is used to play cards. This card over here costs 4 mana, so you can play it on, say, turn 4, which is the opponent's turn. Now, what this does is really interesting. Basically, it creates a structure of alternating, escalating positives and negatives. Imagine your turn is a positive event for you because you're going to advance your game plan. Your opponent's turn is a positive event for them, but it's a negative event for you. So on turn 1, you have a small positive, then they have a small negative for you, then you have a slightly bigger positive, they play a slightly better card, so it's a slightly bigger negative, and this escalates until you win with a big giant, like 6 to 7 to 8 cost card, or they do that to you instead. That's how these games work. And so if you look into it from that angle, you can see that this is a Greek tragedy if you lose, and it's a Hollywood ending if you win. We have alternating, escalating positives and negatives, and that's when the game works well. When the game doesn't work well, however, is when the structure breaks. If you draw all 9 cost cards in your opening hand, you will not get to play anything for the first several turns of the game. It'll be just a negative from your opponent, then you do nothing, then your opponent does a bigger negative, then a bigger negative, then a bigger negative, and this is a rage quit moment because the structure of fun has been violated. Now, not every game needs to happen exactly this way. In fact, if it happens too often, it becomes a bit predictable, and our brains tend to get really tired of things that are predictable. So having a bad game or a weird game every now and then makes you a little bit more grateful for the normal game when it's going well. But this is really easy to see. I saw somebody in the chat mention earlier that they hate Magic's mana system, even though it does something very similar. Now, what they often, and they said, like, on the chat, I just played the new set with a friend last weekend, and probably half our games were ruined by one player not hitting mana on the draw. What this means is that in Magic, you don't get a guaranteed 1 mana every turn. You have to play land cards in your hand, and you can only play 1 land card every turn. If you, for example, start with 2 lands in hand and then never draw any for the rest of the game, you'll have a little positive, then a bigger positive, then you'll stay at 2 mana, on turn 3, then 2 mana on turn 4, then 2 mana on turn 5. Again, the structure of fun is broken. We see the structure of fun in almost all forms of level design, and we see it in almost all forms of good strategy games. League of Legends does this the same way. That's why characters level up over time. That's why respawns are very forgiving in the start, where you have death is a small thing early on. You're only out of the game for a few seconds. Then it becomes a bigger and a bigger thing. We go from slightly doing chip damage on towers to crushing the nexus. We go from killing small mobs to killing dragons and giant eldritch horrors called the Baron and similar. This idea of the structure of fun underlies most games to a degree that we like. It's not the only way to make something good, but it works really well. It's a very good tool. And this is actually an additional thing I want to hit. I'm going to be telling you about things that can work and do cool things. They are not rules. You don't have to use these tools. You don't have to use a hammer. But when you have a nail, it's good to use a hammer. And there's a reason people often use hammers. So this underlies what I call the build and spend TCG economy. The key elements are, first, you gain more resources every turn, and second, you use your mana or you lose your mana. This is a very important point. If you do not spend your 2 mana you have on turn 2, you do not get to save it on turn 3, and so you don't have access to 5 mana on turn 3. If you don't use your mana, you lose your mana. Now, this does something really positive for the structure of fun. The whole point about the structure of fun is you want players playing cards regularly into escalating, alternating positives and negatives. By doing a use it or lose it mana system, we encourage players to play their cards every turn to build that structure of fun. So that's really important. And however, this means you can't save up for the next turn, and together these rules enforce what's called the mana curve. And this is what I want to talk about in my talk. This mana curve is a natural byproduct of this wonderful mechanics that drive the structure of fun, and it can cause some problems in your game design. So this is what the game wants to happen. On turn 1, you have a 1-drop. On turn 2, you have a 2-drop. On turn 3, you have a 3-drop. On turn 4, you have a 4-drop. You will play these cards roughly in order. You'll draw some extra cards as you go along, but this is a perfect opening hand. Someone in the chat just said, oh god, the perfect hand. Exactly. However, what's interesting about this is there are no choices in this perfect hand. You only have one thing you can do on turn 1, and only one thing you can do on turn 2, and only one thing you can do on turn 3. Now, luckily, Hearthstone has some interesting choices throughout the game. There's choices of whether to attack or whether to attack face, whether to attack a creature. There's choices on other stuff, but as the person in the chat is saying right now, yes, the deck is playing itself right now. You are excited when you see this. It's like you hit a jackpot in the lottery. That can be a fun experience, but there are not deep choices here. This is what the game wants to happen, and it actively discourages choices. In order to make this happen, the game does what's called a mana curve, and we see this in lots of card games. This is a very solid mana curve. Now, what this is doing is saying we want to maximize our resources every single turn. Back in Magic the Gathering's history, decks often didn't play major cards until like turn 4, in the very earliest tournaments. However, one deck came along called the Sly deck. It was piloted famously, not invented by Paul Sly, and it is often called the most important deck in the history of Magic the Gathering. While everybody else was focusing on giant angels and big massive spell effects like Wrath of God, this guy was playing 1-cost cards that were so weak they actively killed each other. He was famously playing a goblin card that died if you ever controlled any dwarves, and his deck also had dwarves. He was that desperate for cheap cards that didn't exist in the game at the time. This deck was utterly dominant. He got second place in the tournament, one of the only people piloting the deck, which is a really good indication of how strong he was, fighting against one of the most powerful decks of all time at the time, Necropotence. And this utterly changed the way people build decks, because he recognized that if you skip the first 3 turns, you're giving up a total of 6 mana. And that's a lot of mana. So he wanted to start building a mana curve that would play cards every turn of the game and use all of its mana. And inefficient cards played early are better than no cards played early. Inefficient is better than 0. So what we often see in card games is a big focus on 2-cost, 3-cost, and 4-cost cards. In some formats where games are faster, the lower end is weighted more heavily. This is not a perfect mana curve, but they mostly look like this. The reason is because you want to maximize your chance to play to use your mana every turn of the game. If you want to play a 2-cost card on turn 2, you haven't drawn many cards by turn 2. You only draw like 1 card a turn. In a Hearthstone, you only start with 3 or 4 cards in your opening hand based on whether you're going first or second. So on turn 2, you only have access to like 4 or 5 cards. Magic, you have access to about like 8 or 9, and that's about a third of those are lands, so they're not actual cards. So if you want to play a 2-cost card on turn 2, you have to have a lot of them in your deck. So if you want to play the 6-cost card over here, though, you have many more turns to draw one of your 6-cost cards. And if you play a 5-cost card on turn 6, you give up a mana, but it's 1 mana later in the game, which doesn't matter as much as earlier mana that you give up, because things can snowball. So decks kind of force themselves into this mana curve, which severely limits the amount of relevant costs developers can put on cards. And Magic also has one. Most of these games have one. So in Magic the Gathering, there's a much bigger focus on 2-cost and 3-cost because there are no hero powers. Hearthstone has a 2-cost hero power you can activate once per turn and at least get rid of some of your mana. In Magic the Gathering, you don't have that, so you need to play a much lower end curve. And this is often the kind of ideal draft deck mana curve. There's always exceptions, but when you're playing the draft format, you tend to want to play this way. Now, let's continue on because mana curves discourage interesting choices. This is a really, really important idea. This is an interesting starting hand. On turn 4, you have 3 options. You can play this defensive 3/5 with taunt, which means the enemies can't attack your face while it's out. Defender of Argus means that if you already have some creatures on the board, it could give them some buffs and play taunt as well. So that might actually benefit your existing cards. And you have Twilight Drake, which gains bonuses for each card in your hand, which means you probably want to play that earlier, all else being equal. But if you're not under pressure, you might want to play Twilight Drake. If you are under pressure, you might want to play the Sen'jin Shieldmaster or the Defender of Argus. This is an interesting decision, and players are very sad when they see this opening hand because they don't want to make interesting choices on a turn. They want to use all their mana efficiently. Nobody's going to look at this and say this is the perfect opening hand. Further, mana curves encourage what I call linear strategies. Magic the Gathering, really, you have to pick, and same thing with Hearthstone and similar games, you've got to tend to pick an archetype that usually falls into a hybrid or just a single version of aggro, control, and mid-range. These decks are characterized by the role they take on the mana curve. Now, there are other types of archetypes. Combo exists, there's aggro control, and so on. But all of that tends to focus on the same core concept of how fast are you trying to win the game. Now, aggro decks tend to beat control decks. Control decks focus on really powerful late game strategy, trying to basically build resources over the course of the game and win in the end game. As such, they play more powerful cards later on, and they just try to live long enough to get to that point. They're not trying to win early, they're just trying to survive until they can dominate the game. Aggro decks are focused entirely on the early game when the control deck is weakest, and they try to destroy the control deck and usually have a big advantage. Now, mid-range decks beat aggro decks. Mid-range are tending to play in the middle of the mana curve, and they tend to be playing just a little bit slower than the aggro deck, but their cards are more powerful. And that means that the aggro deck has less time to dominate the game, and the mid-range deck tends to beat the aggro deck. However, the mid-range decks tend to have a lot of trouble beating the control decks fast enough, so control tends to dominate mid-range. They don't put as much pressure on the control deck, and so they die. This is a very, very solid triangle. It explains a lot of stuff, and it really explains how strategies are governed by it. Now, if you look at some of these articles back on what the original Magic decks were playing that were so bad, one of the major things people point out is that they had very diversified strategies. They had control elements, they had mid-range elements, they had combo elements. They weren't focused on just executing one single game plan that based around a certain position on the mana curve. And that is what made them so weak, because they were trying to have interesting options, and that is not the point of this type of game. This leads to one strategy, similar sequences. You focus on early, middle, or late. You plan to play cards in specific orders. This is a big issue. 3-cost cards can't be played on turn 1. You want to play, so when you're building your deck, you think, okay, I'm going to play these cards roughly on the turn 2 to 3, these cards on 3 to 4, these cards on 4 to 5, and your deck can change which combination you get, but there's very specific buckets of what a good game plan looks like. And this creates huge matchup variance. Some archetypes have significant advantages versus others, as I've mentioned already, and it can feel often that the game is weighted heavily for you or against you just based on the random matchup. A lot of tournament reports focus heavily on trying to predict what your opponents are playing, so you can play a deck that has a crushing matchup advantage against them. And then even if you guess right, you have to hope that your small sample size across like 7 games of the tournament matches you up against them, against those decks. That is a really, really big idea. So what can we do about this? First off, you don't have to do anything. It's fun to sometimes play a game and get that feeling like a slot machine of, hey, I just want all the numbers to line up in the exact order. In a slot machine, that's 777. In a aggro hunter, that's 123. That is a fun thing, and you get to play a game while you're doing it rather than just put money into a slot machine. It's a very similar psychology. Additionally, this has some other advantages. The fact that matchup matters so much and your choices are so limited means that weak players who have just started playing can often beat very experienced, like 15-year veterans like me, because there's only so much I can do with my deck. I can improve my odds of success substantially, and if you and I play, if you're a new player, like 10 games, I'm going to win more of them. And I have interesting stuff to think about in terms of attacking and blocking and sequencing some of my cards. But largely speaking, we're going to the deck is going to determine and the draw order is going to determine a lot of our performance. So if you are trying to focus on a game that is more skill driven, which is not always better, but let's talk about that, there's some stuff you can do. And here's what we tried. I was working on a game called Faeria as my first major job in the game industry. I did a lot of things really poorly, and that I wish I could go back and change. And also, however, we did a lot of things right. Great people were running this game. I was not in charge of it by any means. A lot of the brilliance is not coming from me at all, of course. But I want to talk about what we did, why we were doing it, because we were trying to explicitly address this problem. Some things went incredibly well, some things did not. So in building this teardown, I actually sort of was building this for another reason, and I asked, hey, do people want to see this teardown? So that's why we're talking a lot about Faeria. So what is Faeria? Magic the Gathering meets StarCraft. Faeria is a digital card game with a living board. Basically, we want to put some StarCraft in our Magic the Gathering. Faria's whole point was that we wanted to create a game where the player controlled their fate, not the card game itself. We want to create a game where cards were options, not obligations. So this is the baseline of Faeria. Your goal in Faeria is to destroy the enemy god and to basically control the board in the process. As you do that, you damage them with creatures and spells. You got to get your opponents over to their face and start attacking them. So to do that, you got to build lands to summon your creatures. Faeria starts with an empty board, and players build lands each turn to expand and connect to it. Creatures must be summoned on your land. And the lands form the board they fight on. Right now in this image, there are no lands that are like next to each other, but very shortly, they're going to be a connection point. And so creatures will have to fight on this board that you are building as you play. Here we're seeing a very classic rush approach versus a heavy control approach, because as the third point is that you collect Faeria to play for cards. You gain 3 Faeria every single turn. Faeria is the main resource for cards. You can see that both these cards down the bottom of the screen cost 3 Faeria. So that's a very nice little example. And you can also collect extra Faeria from the Faeria wells. There are 4 major resource points on the map, and you can collect them to gain additional Faeria. Each turn, there is 1 Faeria in each well, and your creatures can collect Faeria from wells they're next to on their turns. This doesn't even cost the creature an attack. As long as the creature is next to that well, you can gain those resources. So right now, the player that is choosing to go very aggressive in this game state right now is giving up a lot of overall economy, and the defensive player is trying to build a defensive system, build some creatures up, set up some harvesters and collect, and try to efficiently gain more Faeria every turn. That's what we're seeing in this tactic right now. Faeria wells are great. One of the interesting things is by having 4 Faeria wells in the battlefield, you can more than double your economy versus your opponent by having 7 Faeria to their 3 if you get all of them. However, going for all of them is a very expensive investment because you need to put creatures next to them, which means they're not next to other things. They're not defending your face as well. So the key idea was the player-driven economy. In TCGs like Magic and Hearthstone, the economy controls the players. We've talked about that. In Faeria, we wanted the players to control the economy. So here's how it worked. You gain 3 Faeria every turn, and you can save your Faeria for later. This was really, really important. And this was by far the biggest decisions that we made. Instead of gaining 1, 2, 3, 4, and you had to use it or lose it, we wanted to give you 3 each turn, and you could save it for later. By giving you 3 each turn, we created anything that cost 3 or less was suddenly a thing you could consider playing on turn 1. This created an immediate variance on turn 1 and made it not just a let's skip the turn to get to the good stuff turn. The next idea was saving your Faeria for later. This card, Verduran Force, would normally be a control card in most card games because it costs 6 resources to play. In this case, 6 Faeria. Now, because most aggro decks are not going to play a 6-cost card, it's not very interesting to the vast majority of decks out there. In fact, I think one reason that the Commander format, Magic the Gathering, is so popular is because the games are increase the life totals and slow things down to such an extent that the game is much harder to rush people down in, meaning people have time to play all the interesting 6-cost cards and more that they don't usually get to play in those games and in other formats. However, in Faeria, Verduran Force was an interesting rush card. It was also an interesting mid-range card, and it was sometimes used in control. You could play Verduran Force on turn 2 if you skipped your turn 1 entirely, or you might never play it. You might never have time to take a turn off and save up for it, or you might play it only once you gained a lot of well advantage and gained a lot of extra economy to make it easier to save up. Additionally, there was added agency. You can get more Faeria in multiple ways. Not only could you harvest from the wells themselves, meaning that decks that wanted to save up for big cards in hand might be more interested in them than usually, you also could gain 1 additional Faeria every turn. Faeria had this thing called the action wheel. Every turn you could use it to build a land, or you could use it to gain 1 Faeria, or you could use it to draw a card. This created a huge avenue for players to both gain additional strategy by using their resources effectively, and they were rewarded heavily for only building lands where that was tactically the most efficient. The best players in the game build many fewer lands than new players. New players will often build almost twice the lands they do. So if they build like 6 additional lands, that's like 6 Faeria or 6 cards that they're playing behind. So good players can be much more efficient, and how well you can judge the value of different strategic positions massively increases your game plan. Additionally, you can plan ahead a little bit to get a little bit of extra Faeria or get extra cards if you have too much. This means you are constantly having options. So this means that ultimately cards are options, not obligations. Verduran Force is an option you are always considering. It is not an obligation. So with the living board, we had the other major piece of strategy. This is a screenshot from a rather smug player who's utterly amazing, playing another player that's utterly amazing in a top tournament match. In this game, we see both players doing very different things than the other game did. The first game was a very defensive opening versus a rush. This game, we have people going across the sides of the wells. Now, what's interesting here is that you can not only build a board that changes how you play each time, and certain spaces have big strategic implications, you can avoid your opponent's creatures. The ability to avoid your opponent's strength adds so much depth to strategy. One thing in League of Legends that works very well is if your opponents are just over-leveled compared to you, you can focus on avoiding avoiding conflict. The game Wild Rift, which I've been playing way too much of recently, has an emote you can trigger, or a pre-recorded message that says, "Farm, don't fight," which means basically avoid fighting the opponent right now. Just focus on gaining resources, because if we're further behind, we can hope to catch up when they hit the resource cap. And so being able to avoid your opponent's strength is very important. Here, the opponent has a 3/4 creature out versus 2 3/3s. This would be an extremely powerful position to be in, usually, because you could trade 1 3/4 for 2 3/3s. You do 3 damage to them, they do 3 damage to you, but you'll survive with 1 health, and the next turn you can kill their other 3/3. The fact that 3/4 is really far out of position means that it is like 4 turns away from influencing these 3/3s in any fashion. So basically, this means that where you play your cards matters immensely. Often, if your opponent is dominating on one part of the board, you can avoid them and play elsewhere and push for a win in other ways. This guy's sad. So the Core of Faeria's idea here was that a player-driven economy plus a living board equaled a non-linear strategy, and skilled players would constantly shift between aggression and the economy. This was really, really interesting. Often in Faeria, we would get wildly conflicting reports about matchup variance. Like, we'd have some incredibly skilled players, some of the top on the ladder, saying a certain matchup was 70-30 one direction, the type of matchup breakdowns you usually see in games like Magic the Gathering and so on. Like, if you're playing this game with with equal players skill, you have one deck, they have the other, you'll win 70% of the time. Other skilled players, also in the balance testing group, would say it was 70-30 the other direction. And we could not resolve these conflicts, and they happened all the time, until we started getting them playing the game together on the same side of the board. Like, we put them both in a like screen share call together. We'd have 2 or 3 players on each side, and they would start seeing opportunities the other players had missed. Like, some players would tunnel vision on their strategy, and the other player would say, "Oh, no. We're defending right now, but we shouldn't keep defending. After you kill them here, we have a 2-turn window to counter rush and turn our control deck into an aggro deck. And that means we have to save up resources to plan for that. And we need to mulligan for this card so that we can transition effectively. Because this card is mostly being used for defense, but it can also be used for rush. And so if we counter rush in that 2-turn window, we're going to crush them. And if you miss that window, you're going to die." And then the other player would find a similar element in the other matchup, and you would often have players constantly evaluating whether they could beat their opponent on economy, or whether they had to put an end to the game more quickly. And so these immense depth of how you played your game would mean that a lot of the best decks would be played entirely differently, match to match. You could play the same deck more aggressively, then you could fall back and play it more, play for value. Then you can turn it into a rush deck. Then you can play it back into defense, and it would constantly be flowing back and forth between what you're considering and how you're accomplishing your strategies versus what your opponent is doing. It was really cool. So here's what we gained from all this. Really crazy depth, as you can probably guess. I've heard some people, including brilliant card game designers, describe Faeria as one of the most skill testing games in like card game design, and also one of the most just deep and endless games where skill matters the most in the card game genre. And so the large piece of that is the strategic dimensions. Now, what are strategic dimensions? Dimensions normally describe the position of a point in space. Strategic dimensions describe the position of a player in a game. Whenever I'm analyzing a game, I try to think about the strategic dimensions. What are the types of things I'm trying to advance or trade for in order to improve my position of a game? What makes a better position versus my opponent? Now, most games only have 2 or 3. For example, chess primarily has 3. It's described as time, how fast you are ahead of your opponent. Often you can gain time by putting the king in check. They have to move the king. They don't want to move the king, so it's like you got a free move. Material, obviously, like if you're up or down a queen, that's worth material. It's scored that way. And then quality. How good are your pieces? A bishop that is in the middle of the board controls far more squares than a bishop that is tucked into the corner and only controls a single diagonal. Additionally, a bishop that is blocked by its own pawns is much weaker and controls and threatens fewer spaces than one that is free and developed. So time, material, and quality. Go is often described in shape, basically shape, strength, shape, territory, and influence. That's another big idea. So that is those are their main 3 strategies. Territory is how many points you're controlling. Influence is how far your stones are reaching. And basically the shape is the relative efficiency of your stones. You could probably break it down to just influence and territory, but I think that the shape of your stone is very valuable as well, and it's worth considering. Some players play primarily based off of territory, some play primarily based on influence, other play primarily based off shape. Faeria has 6. I was breaking this game down with the benefit of about 4 years since I've worked on the game, and I wanted to ask a lot of the top players as to how they thought about their games. So based on my own knowledge and based off of theirs, I started breaking down into, I couldn't get it lower than 6 key strategic dimensions. Some of these things have overlap, but they are individual concepts. So the first 3 are micro-oriented. First ones of that is resources. This represents how many cards you have in hand and how many Faeria you have in your bank, or your Faeria pool, as we called it. This is basically your ability to play cards on the game. If you have no cards in hand and you have no Faeria, there is very little you can do. Often, recognizing your opponent is low on Faeria is a good time to rush them, because if they have to start playing cards defensively, they're not fighting for the board, and they start suffering accordingly. Resources and keeping your eye on them are valuable. The next major piece, though, is development. A card on the board is worth more than a card in hand. It's the opposite of a bird. A card in the board is worth 2 cards on the hand quite often, because it can affect the board and impact it directly. Also, Faeria has, like many card games, a rule that creatures cannot attack the turn they're played, so you have to develop them a turn in advance. So development affects not only creatures on the board, but structures and lands. If you are down on lands, then you just don't have many abilities to play cards or generate resources. Additionally, something I have glossed over to this point, but it is valuable for this piece of understanding, is that many cards did not only require Faeria to play, you also had to have special lands. So this was a way of creating a soft color pie. Like a card might require 2 lakes in order to play it. And so once you had 2 lakes, it wasn't like a resource, like you could only use 2 lake energy a turn. If you had 2 lakes, it was like a threshold prerequisite. So you could play 20 cards that all cost 2 lakes in a turn if you had 2 lakes. The idea was to ask people to make soft commitments to individual colors, and that way you can mix colors, but you wouldn't want to mix too many, and also to create some later game escalation by having a few cards that cost a lot of lakes, or a lot of deserts, or a lot of lands in general. But mostly, cards in the game cost about 0 to 2, sometimes as many as 3 special lands, so that most of them could be played at most stages of the game. Having a lot of special lands out meant that you could tell what your opponent was even able to play. If your opponent has only 2 deserts, you know they're not going to play a 2 mountain style burn spell right away. You have warning. Influence. Influence is a major concept that I took from Go in order to explain Faeria. In Go, we talk about how stones radiate light on the board. It is extremely bright, and it fades away as the stone gets further away. Influence represents a piece's ability to influence things elsewhere on the board. So on this map, we have strong influence with this 6/3 is controlling spaces nearby it. It also has charge, meaning it can move multiple spaces at a time, but there aren't that many lands around it, so it is limited in that regard. This 4/4 is heavily influencing the side of the map over here, but it is very lightly influencing the other side of the map because it would take many spaces for it to go through. Understanding influence is a key idea to understanding how to beat your opponents. Good players would often played cards that most people didn't understand why they were very good. One of the best cards in the game, Windborn Champion, was almost entirely ignored when we started building the game because it looked like a kind of stupid 5 Faeria 5/5 for 5 deserts. By contrast, green got a 5/10 for 5 forests and 5 Faeria. So a 5/5 versus a 5/10, it's utterly insane. But it had flying and charge 5, meaning it didn't need to stay on lands, and it could move up to 5 spaces in a turn, meaning it could go kind of across the entire board like a bishop. Only in a straight line still. Now, most players thought this card wasn't useful at all because it doesn't matter where it goes, it's still going to die. But the influence meant that by playing just 5 Faeria, this thing controlled the entire board. It influenced every space on the board all at once, meaning you never could actually get into a fight with it. It was always attacking your weakest point, and it was always winning for that reason. Ended up being an immense card because of this concept of influence. And if we had had that formal concept earlier in the strategy process, we would have recognized this card was crushing advantage rather than having to take months to figure it out. Somebody mentioned in the chat, tempo is another thing they've heard about in Magic the Gathering terminology. Yeah, tempo is basically how efficiently you're using your resources. The whole idea of if you skip your first 3 turns, you might have more total card advantage, but you're behind in tempo because you've lost access to those refreshing resources. You have not spent your 6 mana worth of stuff effectively. Tempo decks primarily focus on maximizing the early game and then keeping your opponent off tempo. Like cards that return a card to your opponent's hand sacrifice a resource. You have lost your card that you've just spent, but you have hurt their development, which means that they might have a lot of cards in hand, but they will never have the time to play them all because they are bottlenecked on how many resources they have on a given turn. If you spend 4 mana playing a card to try to stabilize, and your opponent then plays a card to return it to your hand, that means you don't get to play it again until next turn, and they can keep snowballing their early game advantage. That is the concept of tempo. It is why a 2-cost 2/2 is stronger than a 3-cost 2/2. Even though eventually you should get to play that card, you can't play it as early, so it has less time to affect the board and less time to snowball into an advantage. So the macro dimensions. Pressure is the main idea. How fast am I killing my opponent? How fast can I reduce their life total to 0? That's a major question. The next piece of it is economy. Economy is how many resources am I giving on a given turn in terms of 3 Faeria a turn, 1 card a turn, and any number of wells I'm controlling. Right now, the opponent is putting a lot of pressure on the opponent's face. There is a 6/3 next to them that will kill them in 4 hits. It will nearly kill them in 2. There are cards that yellow has as well to boost this thing's power to 7 very effectively. So the player that is on the defense down here is under a lot of pressure, and the player at the top has made a decision to trade economy for pressure. They have decided to to sacrifice economy advantage in order to create pressure on the opponent. Now, the player at the downside is the opposite. They are sacrificing pressure. Their cards aren't anywhere near their opponent in order to gain economy. A lot of elements of gameplay are based off of a lot of elements of gameplay are based off of the different resources that you're breaking down. If in Faeria, if you ever have economic dominance and pressure on your opponent, you generally always win because your opponent is now under pressure. They have to defend themselves. And if you have economy, you're getting more resources and they can't afford to contest your economy. One of the big mistakes a lot of players would make is they would focus on economy and just sort of keep gaining resources and not try to then throw a lot of those resources at their opponent's face. That gave their opponents a lot of time to come back and made their resources matter less and less. In the chat, somebody says, I will fight a view of game design which says chess has 3 dimensions, but economy and resources are separate dimensions in Faeria. This is actually important. Resources are how many things you have right now. Economy represents how many things you're getting on a turn-to-turn basis. So the idea is that on resources right now, if I have 10 Faeria right now in my bank and 10 cards in hand, I have a lot of resources. In Faeria, however, the idea, there is additionally an on-game flow. In chess, if you could gain additional material on a regular basis, that would mean that you should be playing defensively because your opponents are gaining resources more slowly than you. In Faeria, you are gaining if you have an economic advantage, you want to play defensively at first to snowball that advantage, but then you need to turn it into pressure to try to force a conclusion. That is a totally different element of strategy. It is very possible to have a massive resource advantage and a very weak economic advantage. If that ever happens, you need to either fight back for economy or you need to force your opponent to die before their economy overwhelms you. Because the game states are different and they require different executions, that means there are different strategic dimensions. Additionally, Junkmail, I know you said that I'm oversimplifying chess. It wasn't me. It was, I believe, either Kasparov or Karpov that broke chess into these 3 dimensions. So you can argue with the Grandmaster if you want. So the next thing is game flow. Game flow is the 3rd dimension of Faeria, and I argued with myself a lot about whether this should be part of economy or not, but ultimately it was a different element that all the top players were using to analyze what they should do on the board. So while it's similar to economy, it also, and similar to pressure in some ways, it ultimately changed how people evaluated the board, and so I found it was valuable to think of it differently. Now, game flow is the relative strength of your deck versus your opponents at different pieces of the game. So the idea between game flow is some decks have endless pressure late in the game. Burn decks, for example. In Faeria, burn decks don't need to attack you directly to do damage. They can just do damage by fighting your creatures, because their creatures do damage every time they fight, or they can do damage directly via direct damage spells, named appropriately via burn and so on. This means that if you're playing against a burn deck, you need to put more pressure on them than otherwise, because even if you get an endless economy advantage, they will eventually just kill you, even if you don't have board dominance. You need to push for a conclusion in the game. However, that doesn't mean you should go directly for the face. Sometimes that means you should fight over wells at first and then get a big economic advantage and then transition to the face. Alternatively, some decks like Soul Eaters were very, very good on turn 6 and okay on turn 4 and very weak early on. This is because they had 3 cards in their deck that cost 6 special lands that gained +1/+1 for each creature that had died this game. And so they got bigger and bigger as the game went on. Now, this meant that you had to know that those Soul Eaters were coming, and you might be winning slightly in the early game and dominating them, but you had to significantly punch through at that point when you had an advantage. You could not afford to trade at economic parity early on or to put only slight pressure on them. You had to punch through when you had this early game advantage, and you had to gain a big economic lead to challenge the Soul Eaters so that you could draw extra cards to get your hard removal to answer them, or you needed to counter them in the first place. On the other hand, the Soul Eaters recognized that once they got to turn 6, they tended to be the strongest they would ever be in the game, and it was now a good time for them to push the advantage, to not let their opponent draw out. So if we saw, for example, a Soul Eater deck versus a Burn deck, the Burn deck would want to be dominating in the early game. Then they would want to be playing defensively once the Soul Eaters came out, because that would allow them to win the long game at that point. On the other hand, if the Soul Eater deck needed to suddenly go from defense to rush to try to turn that into their advantage, which would mean that different decks with the game flowing for you or against you based on your deck strategy would influence the way you were analyzing pressure and economy. And often, unlike other games, things would not constantly be in the same direction. Aggro decks tend to get weaker as the game goes on in games like Magic the Gathering and Hearthstone. In Faeria, decks would often have spikes at different points and would trade back and forth when they wanted to be aggressive. Even what was often called the simplest rush deck, Yellow Rush, which gained resources whenever they attacked their opponent's face, and so they often, which is what your opponent's doing here, would ignore wells at the start of the game. They would be dominant in the first 3 turns, then they would be extremely weak, then they'd be stronger later, then they'd be weak again, then they'd be really strong at the end. There was a constant ebb and flow to the Waves of Faeria strategy, and this created immense depth. One of my favorite elements of Faeria strategy to indicate how deep it ended up getting was that the players completely changed after a year of constant play what they recommended doing against a simple rush deck. At first, they said you should try to control these 4 lands. We see some 3 empty spaces directly in front of your orb to make the enemy have to walk around you to get lands near your orb. Eventually, they switched to this strategy, which is why this guy is playing this way, which is that they want to force Yellow Rush to build lands in the center and then try to kill them and get creatures on top of them. Even something as simple as the opening 3 or 4 turns in a land build against a straightforward rush deck were all the lands people thought mattered the most turned out they mattered the least, which was a really fun element there. So this got into a bunch of different skills this tested. First was game sense. This was something that was immensely important. You had to have your strong threat and opportunity assessment and a strong matchup analysis. You needed to understand to win at Faeria that often you would have a 1 or 2 turn opportunity to say your enemy has created a rush deck, they've smashed you up, you've managed to survive, you've killed their attackers, they're low on resources. What do? Most control players who are new would start by trying to expand further to take over more wells to get a bigger economic advantage. This was suicide. This gave the rush decks enough time that they could then build up another attack and push for a win, and your resources were now more spread out and had a harder time defending yourself. The correct play, which would almost always win you the game if you survived well in the opening and playing against a normal, very simple rush deck, was to build a really unintuitive counter rush right up the middle of the board, because this was a window where if you could force the rush deck to play defensively, you would get to kill them while keeping up your economic advantage and destroy them. So because they had a resource deficit and you had economic advantage, you could exploit that with a counter rush. Often games would create situations where even amazing players at top tournament levels would simply not be able to see these opportunities that people in the chat were seeing, and would throw away won games because they missed a 1 or 2 turn window about when they had to be able to exploit a rush, or when their opponents were starting to put up a snowballing advantage that they would not be able to defeat. So they had to either challenge it directly, but if they couldn't challenge it effectively, they had to create a rush instead. This threat and opportunity assessment was insanely important. Resource management, pretty obvious. You want to make sure you're using your cards effectively. If you're playing against a deck that has a few key, extremely big creatures they build up to over the course of the game, you want to save hard removal for that. This also meant the power wheel was interesting. The power wheel was the thing that you determine whether you're building a land, drawing a card, or gaining a Faeria each turn. So that was another element of skill. Positioning, hugely important. Where you're building your land mattered immensely. We talked about that already. A lot of new players were taught how important certain land spaces were worth. Some of them were called siege spots. Some of them are called double harvests. Some of them were influence oriented. Some of them were resource oriented. Some of them were aggro oriented. Some of them were defense oriented. There were so many different elements to it, and understanding when and how many lands to build was really important. And of course, maneuvering creatures mattered a lot. If you play the top players in the game, often they will always seem to have their creatures exactly where you want to go, a turn ahead of time, and it feels like they're just doing magic. I've watched so many top players who've been playing this game for since it came out daily at top levels of tournaments, and it is just amazing how subtly they seem to get these advantages. And finally, information gathering. you care a lot about deck prediction. For example, what you see your opponents do first opening lands, and you see the way they're building their lands. That tells you a lot about their intent and what they have in hand. Good players, this is not just unique to Faeria, by the way, this is just a breakdown of the strategy in Faeria, could often predict an opponent's entire opening hand based off of like the first land they played and where they played it. You could very quickly identify what the common options were, how they were playing them, and because players had so many options, you knew a lot about like if they were playing very well. The fact they were doing certain options instead of others in certain situations meant that you could kind of predict what their other options were if you were really good. And this relates to hand tracking. Not my favorite part of strategy, but it definitely exists. If you know that your opponent did not kill your really important 2-health creature when you played it, they probably don't have a burn spell that deals 2 damage in hand, meaning that of those 4 cards in hand, none of them are a burn spell, and you kind of want to keep an eye on that over the course of the game. So that's a lot of stuff we gained. What did we lose? Escalation. I just thought I would put a flatline image here. The flatline is very important. When I mentioned so much about the structure of fun, this is more like what Faeria's structure looked like. We did not gain escalating resources as the game went on. Originally, the idea was these special lands I mentioned that you would build a forest on turn 1, and then maybe another forest, and then maybe another forest, and then at some point you stop building forests and you start drawing extra Faeria and drawing extra cards. That means eventually the game flatlines. It was really strategically interesting, but unless we were going to start making like a 1 forest card on turn 1, a 2 forest card on turn 2, a 3 forest card on turn 3, and that would just reinvent the mana curve, so we didn't want to do that. This forced us to create a lot of cards in each major deck archetype that pushed games towards conclusions. Rush decks had to have cards that would like gain stats for every time you attacked the opponent's face, or had burn spells for direct damage that could finish off an opponent that had stabilized. If you look at cards like the Colossi cycle, a Wave Crash Colossus would gain Faeria for every time you had harvested from certain wells, which encouraged you to basically get well control and move in that direction. Another one, Windstorm Colossus, cost less for every single event you had played that game, which is like spells. So that would focus on event-heavy decks. So what happened was we would have creatures that would get bigger or cost less, or other ways to push a game towards a conclusion based on certain things that had happened over the game. This severely limited our design space, and it severely limited our ability to design variance in strategy in all sorts of ways. And if new players did not have these cards, or did not know how to use them, or did not understand the incentives, they could get utterly destroyed. And this created 2 major problems, one of which was that the games get very snowbally. If you started winning some Faeria trades and successfully snowballed that into pressure or more economy, you would end up just wrecking players, and it was very hard to make a comeback. It wasn't that bad at lower levels because people made so many mistakes all the time due to the depth that you could help to outplay them and to counter their advantages. But the better you got at the game, the more brutal it was, and the more brutal early advantages could snowball. However, the other issue was because games did not actually escalate as they pushed towards a conclusion, we couldn't really create that many comeback cards because that would make the games escalate even weaker. So we had these 2 problems that went directly against each other, and it was really hard to solve. I really like what we did within that, but I would love to see a system that addressed it. Again, League of Legends, by creating escalation, there is snowball elements in the game, but the advantages matter more and more as the game goes on. And one major element of the Baron kill is that if you kill the Baron character in that game, you get a massive temporary buff that you can try to use to snowball the other way and either push for a quick win, secure some more objectives. It creates hope to create these big spikes over the course of the game goes on. So while the game snowballs, it also means that the resources and the kills and the impacts and the objectives are getting bigger and bigger over time. So there is hope. So this kind of indicates where I think the path of card games should kind of go. There are 3 major elements that I think are important in card games for economies. 1, you want to give players options every turn. 2, you want to create nonlinear strategy. Nonlinear strategy I am defining as not locking in to a single game plan before the game starts. You should be able to adapt your game plan itself, not just your tactics. Options each turn give you different tactics each turn. But the ability to adopt your game plan, to focus more on playing long game and economy this game, and then focus more on turning these same tools into aggro and rush later, that is immensely compelling in Faeria. And it was one of my favorite things about the game, learning constantly how to reevaluate my strategy with my cards being tools for different strategies, some being more rush-oriented, some being more mid-range oriented, some being more defense-oriented, but all of them being able to work together in different strategies. That ended up being fantastic. And a lot of the most powerful decks in the history of the game were mid-range oriented, the most flexible. Finally, escalation. This is something that Hearthstone, Magic the Gathering nailed utterly, and it's something that we lost when we got rid of that. Escalation drives games towards the conclusions. It creates hope for comebacks. It reduces the impact of early RNG. It does so many wonderful things, and most importantly, it builds the structure of fun. So playing those games just creates a more positive experience on that level than playing a game with a more static system. I would love, if I was going back, to figure out how to work escalation into Faeria, and also how to encourage players playing cards more regularly so that board sweepers could be created. In a game where you can bank your resources constantly, we had to create pressure to play at every turn, and that also limited the types of things we could play. If you were afraid of your opponent having a sweeper, that would further slow things down and prevent escalation. So there were very limited sweepers in the game. So other interesting approaches. Other games are breaking this. Early on in the chat, I noticed that somebody asked a great question about what about games that don't use this system. And this talk's already really long, so I'm not going to go into a lot of them. But many games don't do this. Yu-Gi-Oh! Doesn't do this. Many games don't do this. And have other advantages or disadvantages. And obviously, Faeria doesn't do the Hearthstone or MTG style economy. Pokemon kind of does. You play one energy a turn, but also it has a different attack system. So I want to talk about a few interesting approaches that I think are really, really cool. One is Legends of Runeterra spell mana. Now, the spell mana of Legends of Runeterra when I first saw it, I thought, man, this is a lot of complexity. But the more I play with it, the more I realized that it actually was a great example of adding a bit of nonlinear strategy into a card game that otherwise was following a use it or lose it, gain one each turn Hearthstone Magic style system. So in this game, you have the 6 mana is how much you have right now on this normal turn, but you also have up to 3 spell mana at any given time. Now, your normal mana, if you don't spend it at the end of the turn, up to 3 of it becomes spell mana. Spell mana can be saved from turn to turn. So you can never have more than 3 spell mana, but it can only be used on spells. It can't be used on creatures. It can't be used on landmarks. It has to be used on spells. This creates some really interesting stuff. Many games of Runeterra, you can afford to skip the first 2 turns of plays. If you don't get a 1-drop or a 2-drop, it's not the end of the world. You can save up all 3 spell mana and then start using it to counter your opponents and to get back in the game. Additionally, it makes more expensive spells very different than creatures. A 7-cost spell in Legends of Runeterra is relatively playable. You can just bank your 3 mana over a few different turns, and then it's really like, because you're saving it, it's only like the 7 mana spell costs 4, or a 4 mana spell costs 1 of your normal allotment of mana. A 7-cost card in Runeterra, if it's not a spell, is very hard to play, but expensive spells show up on lots of decks. This also means that in some turns you have options between asking, do I want to save up for my spell mana and have some backups for my creatures for better board control, or do I want to be playing out my creatures on curve and trying to threaten a lot of additional early pressure? There is a lot of interesting decisions that happen in the first few turns of this game based on this option to conserve some amount of spell mana. However, because you can only bank 3 of it, unlike in Faeria, you still have a pressure to play your creatures aggressively and to make things happen. That, I think, is something that's really, really cool. Solforge is also a game that sadly is no longer playable, I believe, but it had some brilliantly interesting ideas. Solforge was fundamentally what I call a draw 5, play 2 system. You started with 5 cards in hand. You would play 2 of them. There was no mana costs. You just played 2. Very easy for people to wrap their head around. And then you would draw up to 5 again. Now, unfortunately, in my opinion, Solforge, you would discard all the cards you didn't play and then draw 5 new ones, which was a lot for new players and for experienced players even. I often look at format, if I was doing this myself, I would do like you start with 5, play 2, and then every turn you draw 2. Picking 2 out of 5 is a very interesting choice. The different combinations can be very fun, and you can have a nice satisfying sense of like combo and synergy between 2 choices out of 5. It's very straightforward. Now, the reason that Solforge did discard your hand, drop to 5 is they had a secondary system that was getting their access to nonlinear strategy. The system is 99% brilliant. But the last 1% caused problems. When I first saw it, I was just blown away. These cards you could probably see have different levels. You've got this 1 over here on Necrotic Worm and Zombie Infantry on the board. You've got a 2 for Wind Primordial at the top, middle, and you've got a 3 Wind Primordial right next to it. Cards had 3 levels in Solforge. Some of them had more or less, but mostly they all had 3. When you played a 1-cost card, basically a 2-cost version of it was shuffled into your deck. And technically it was a bit more complicated than that. It was like every 4 turns you leveled up, and then only then were all the cards you had played shuffled into your deck at a higher level. And so what was really interesting was you had this great decision between, do I want to play a card that's weaker now but has a stronger level 2 or a really strong level 3, or do I want to play a card that's really good early but makes my future draws weaker because it gets weaker overall in the later game. So there was like a card called Dragon Egg that was most creatures were like 5/5s with good abilities at level 1, and that card was a 0/1. It couldn't even attack, but it shuffled a really powerful dragon into your deck. It's a level 3. You got a Scorchmane dragon that was a 20/20 when most things were like, it had all these powerful abilities when most things were much weaker. So that was a really exciting card. The problem is though that because you only played 2 cards a turn, and every 4 turns you would shuffle those into your deck, you would get hands like this, where you would draw 5 cards, and in the level 3 stage of the game, and none of these cards are level 3. So you're going to ignore these level 1 cards entirely. You're sad you didn't draw any of your level 3 cards, and only these level 2 cards are even worth considering. Choosing from 5 options, you're only choosing from 3. Often you would like draw a card with only two level 2 cards in the level 2 phase of the game, and you were happy because you wanted to only draw your highest level cards. So in level 1 phase of the game, you had fun options: draw 5, play 2. But in level 2, you wanted to only draw 2 of the cards you had leveled up every single turn. If you didn't do that, you fell really far behind, and it was another example of you just want to play the most efficient as possible. You don't want to give yourself interesting decisions. So when the game is working best for you is when you are having the least options. Not ideal. I would love to see a version of Solforge that explored this mechanic but fixed it in different ways. Things like all the cards in your deck level up, but if you do that, that causes issues where you're no longer choosing, interestingly, whether to invest in weaker creatures that get stronger later. There needs to be some solution there. And the core flow of it, though, is just delightful. And as long as you hit your options each turn, which this nails your nonlinear strategy, with this nails, you do get your escalation, though. But then when you get your escalation, you massively spike RNG and you lose your options and nonlinear strategy, which is not the goal of the game at all. So I've got more stuff, but in the appendix, in case anybody has questions that are on topic, but I am done. That is my talk. Why don't we just answer some questions and stuff, if anyone has any in the chat. Yay, applause! I love it. If anyone's recording this, it's just people put applause emojis in the chat. I'm not imagining it. But, are you available for paid consulting? I have very limited time right now, unfortunately. Normally I say yes. If it's a very short term, I might be able to consider it. But I am actually kind of booked right now under a lot of different card games. So happy to find out about your project. If it's very short term, like a very short consultancy of just like a few hours, I might have some time. Normally I am, but I am starting a new job soon. And I am going to have I've already got a lot of people booking me for various things. If you are interested, though, I have many great friends who are brilliant card game designers as well, and we have worked on a lot of this stuff together, at least on the theory crafting side, and I can certainly make some recommendations for anybody that is interested in that. So that is certainly, if you're interested in that, please send me an email at designerdanf@gmail.com, or just message me on Discord if you're here. All right, first question. How do you feel about a dual linear system and a nonlinear system in combination? I think it can totally work. Basically, the call here is like, the core idea is that you need to make sure that it's actually creating incentives for the players. A great example of this, frankly, is in League of Legends. They have a dual linear system and a nonlinear system, and also Legends of Runeterra does as well. The question is, though, what incentives are you creating for players? You need to make sure that they have interesting options every turn, that they have options that can adjust their strategies in interesting directions, and that there is something that pushes them to play things regularly and also pushes the game to be stronger and more impactful and more exciting and bigger over time. For example, the a great example of that, I would say, if I was going to make a game on the spot, would be something like imagine Solforge, but every 4 turns things leveled up. Or, for example, like you played for 8 turns and then only shuffled in the upgraded cards, so you were building your future deck along with some new level 2 cards from that were always shuffled into your deck. So this is a really overcomplicated deck building system, but you can imagine like that way you would have nonlinear options to increase your future deck, but also still have the escalation as things go on. All right, so another question. I got a phone call while you were going over where Faeria missed the mark on escalation. Selfishly asked for a quick recap. Very shortly, yes. Faeria, because you gained 3 Faeria every turn for the whole game, meant that there was never an escalation. That meant that basically once people had the resources they wanted, they could not spend them effectively, and there was very little hope for the future. Small advantages would snowball over the course of the game, and like in StarCraft, I don't think anybody has actually finished a game of StarCraft by the rules in a very long time, because they concede long before they can actually be killed by the rules of the game, where all their buildings are destroyed, because they know it's hopeless. Faeria had a lot of concessions as well. A really very actually, in fact, one of my favorite stories about it was one player at a top tournament thing who was very new to the game but was brilliant and dominating ladder. He got into a late tournament match and he utterly dominated the game. He controlled like 3 out of 4 wells, and he had so many more resources in his bank, and the opponent was just totally out of resources. And so we knew he was going to win, and he couldn't win. He just kept fighting for the board. He just kept going for more resources. He could not ever figure out how to push for a win, or he never chose to. And the opponent eventually drew his entire deck and put together a 9 damage burn combo and just killed the guy. And what's funny is, I realized on the ladder, your opponents concede here. But because it was a tournament, the guy wasn't conceding. He was holding out hope. And so even though the guy had won the game, he had no idea how to actually win it, which really indicates how, if your opponent had played at all competently there, this guy was doomed. We all said he was doomed in the chat. But that's how common concessions were because of snowballing. In Magic the Gathering and Hearthstone, you often have hope for that last turn to turn things around. Give a few examples of escalation. Can players getting more options and choices as the game goes on create a sense of escalation? A sense of escalation, yes, because it feels like you are getting more as the game goes on. But what I mean by escalation here is that the plays get bigger as the game goes on. This is really important because it gives you hope. If you get disadvantaged in the early game, especially in a card game where you have the smallest amount of draws, you have no hope for the end game unless you have escalation, where things can get bigger and more impactful. The escalation in League of Legends is you go from killing tiny minions and maybe getting a single kill and maybe chipping damage on a tower, to killing dragons, winning giant team fights, getting pentakills, unleashing your ultimates in crazy chains, and spiking down, having super minions spawn and spiking down the Nexus. That is the escalation element. It also allows people to have not only hope, but it gives you a lot more design space to make powerful comeback cards. If I could change one fundamental mechanic at MTG, what would it be, how, and why? This is definitely, I would do this thing. I know it's controversial. I don't think I could possibly do it to actual Magic the Gathering because the game is so ingrained and it's such an institution, and this is too big a disruption. I would absolutely take lands out of the deck. I would put lands in either like a separate side deck you play every turn, or I would find another mana system. The Magic the Gathering designers have said so many times that the hope of your opponent not drawing lands is a net win. That if you can hope that they get stuck on lands, you have a hope to beat them. It's one of the only hopes you have in bad matchups and so on. It allows players to blame their failures on the lands, not their skill. In my experience, players will, if you give them any RNG, they will blame the RNG no matter what, and card games already have an element of RNG. I like RNG that changes your options and gives you hope of something awesome happening, not RNG that means that one of you doesn't get to play the game. That, I think, is very frustrating. I do think also that a lot of the more boring turns of certain formats are made more fun, like in Commander, just by hoping that you'll get like lands, because that tension is so painful that if you even get to play on curve, you just feel so good and so relieved that the game kind of feels better by comparison. So there are advantages, but it's a net loss. I would remove that. so if you had some time to reflect on Faeria, what are some ideas you might be able to add to increase escalation in Faeria? There are several things that I've strongly thought about. I don't know what's best. One of the things I would do likely is I would put a cap on how much Faeria you can save, maybe 9, 10, or maybe even just like 6. And maybe more like 8 or 9, I would expect. The idea is I don't want players saving up to 20 Faeria. I want them being forced to actually play things, because one of the important elements that we ran into whenever we designed a global board sweeper, which is something that like you destroy your own stuff, and your opponent's stuff, it's a good comeback card, was that players would just simply not play cards, then play a sweeper, which meant their opponent, if they were smart, would also not play extra cards, and the game would slow down. It would be really frustrating. Our card Doomsday, which was the only sweeper globally we ever managed to make, I believe, that worked, ended up also setting your Faeria to 0 in order to prevent that type of gameplay. But even then, the fear of it made players so afraid to play cards on the board that we had to make it like also deal damage to yourself and also do all this stuff. So it was really hard to make the card work. Eventually it did, but it took so long compared to other card games. So a resource cap would be good. The easy answer would just be to say start with 3 Faeria, but then every turn you gain 4, 5, 6, 7, but you can still bank it. That would, of course, mean that we have to have a different resource cap as the game goes on. Maybe something like you only can bank a certain number of resources every turn. So you can bank up to 6, but you can for next turn, but you still gain above that at the start of your turn. It's not just a total cap. That would be an option. I honestly, though, I want to look at the level up. I think what's really fun is the idea of commanders in card games. I think commanders, the idea of having a hero that represents your deck, like commander format in Magic the Gathering, is such a strong thing, and it's such a strong piece of identity, that instead of describing your deck as red, yellow, burn or something, you can describe your deck as Lord Cypher. That's really fun, and it can really shape your strategies. So I would be looking into commanders that level up over time, get stronger, and make the cards in your deck stronger. If I was doing digital, I would also be doing stuff like Runeterra does, where they have, and Solforge did, where they have champions that level up over time. I would be looking into more cards that get stronger as the game goes on to create escalation on that vector, which I think is really exciting. Okay. Ooh, lots of questions. I will just do a quick scan of these. Oh, actually, Keith asked one earlier. The Wild TCG gave players to include quest cards, allowed to be played as their lands face up, but also allowed players to use any card as their land face down. Do you have any thoughts on such a system like that impacts the mana curve? Yeah, I do. Duel Masters also did this. Basically, well, Duel Masters, which is the most popular card game in Japan still, I think, it was for many years, I'm not sure if it still is, was actually an attempt by Magic the Gathering designers to fix their land system. What they did was they said instead of lands, you could play any card like as a land of its color, I believe. I've never actually played Duel Masters. I've just heard this rules summary. And what they decided was that was actually really bad because players didn't want to play their dragon as a mountain. They wanted to play their dragon. So they were constantly dealing with the sense of playing things they didn't want to play. A lot of games turn cards in your hand into resources as an extra dimension of strategy. Scrolls did this. It doesn't usually work because players hate losing their dragon. And if there was a way to get the dragon back in your hand to play for later, using it as like a land now, but be able to get your dragon back later, that might work. Even if it was just psychologically. Like one thing that Runeterra does, which is really smart, is if you have an extra champion in your hand, because you're not allowed to play it, if you already have the same champion on the board because it's legendary, they turn that card into a spell that's based on that's themed on their champion, like the cool thing that champion does, and then that shuffles an extra copy of the champion into their deck, which psychologically helps so much because you know you'll at least maybe draw that dragon later. So if you could play the dragon in a digital game on the battlefield and then shuffle it into your the dragon into your deck, that would probably work very well. That would at least give you psychologically the feeling that you could get that dragon later. Here's a bunch of questions. Really important to have games end within 20, 30 minutes. Yes, it is. Fantasy Flight Games continually gets away with like 45-minute games or hour games like Netrunner. In physical, you have access. By the way, Netrunner was a major inspiration for our economy. They do really smart things with their economy. Check out Netrunner. It also has a very unique flow of like one player gets to do you basically spend time either gaining resources or spending resources to get points. And so often you will get resources, then spend them to get points. And while you're trying to get points with your resources, your opponent will gain more resources. So there's this nice ebb and flow where like the runner player is really good at the hacking in the beginning, and at the end. But in the middle, the opponent tries to push back. We often looked into this flow. Netrunner has endless problems. It is wildly overcomplicated, but it's such a brilliant game that I would love to see someone create a simplified version based on its genius ideas. Games end within 20-30 minutes. On digital, that is very important. One of the major reasons behind it, though, is there is a limit to how repetitive your story can go. You can have a movie that runs for 6 hours, but people tend to get sick of it. Likewise, a game that lasts for like 40 to 50 minutes, often players tend to get sick of it, and it becomes really difficult to fit it into their schedule, especially in digital. There's a lot of games that I want to play but don't have time to play. If your game can be made just as good but simpler, just as good but faster, it's better. Faster game is better, all else being equal. If all else isn't equal, you're in trouble. However, there's a really sharp limit to how simple you can get a game, especially a game with nonlinear strategy, and how short you can get it is what I really mean. If your turns take on average 45 seconds a turn, a 10-minute game is going to take 450 seconds, a 10-turn game is going to take 450 seconds. So that's 5 turns per player. Well, you could do the math yourself. Often card games, if you have interesting decisions every turn, you have a harsh limit. This is also why I say that good strategy games are not based around making the most difficult decision every single turn. You want to hit minimum viable. I want 2 to 4 interesting choices on every turn. I don't want 7 to 8. That is not useful. I want minimum viable, interesting decision because I need to reach a satisfying decision that I feel like I made a good play in like 30 to 60 seconds. And feel good about myself. So it can't actually be that intricate or complicated in order to make me enjoy myself in this game. It just doesn't work. It has to be a satisfying, simple decision, and the game mechanics have to constantly generate new ones. This is why card games work so well as strategy games, because every turn you are drawing a new card, changing your options. If you play the card, it leaves your hand, you don't have it as an option anymore, so your options change every turn. That's why deck builders almost get like, everybody can make a good deck builder. It's almost hard to make a bad deck builder because the market of cards you're buying changes every turn, and the cards you draw for your resources, what you can buy, change every turn. And then as you buy cards, it changes what you'll buy later. It influences your future. Deck builders are great at nonlinear strategy and great at escalation. Deck builders are just amazing. The engine is so strong that it's almost hard to mess up. That's why we see so many deck builders these days, like Star Realms and everything starting with Dominion, of course, the Legendary series. Everyone makes a deck builder these days, and then Slay the Spire is similar because it's almost hard to mess up. The mechanics are so strong. They hit all 3 of these points. Let's see. I'll answer the other 5 probably later in text for sure, but I want to make sure that people get more questions. Star Wars Destiny. Oh, someone knows Star Wars Destiny. Star Wars Destiny is a future of card games, man. The Transformers TCG took a lot of what made Star Wars Destiny great, and they took a little too much out, but it's really cool. The question was, what is its unique deal with dice rolling mechanics? That was the issue you had. The feel of getting bad rolls, having nothing to help reshape the results, to really bad on its imagery. Interestingly, I think that Star Wars did this well via its card discard mechanic. As you each turn in Star Wars Destiny, you could draw up to 5 cards. So card advantage didn't really matter. You could draw up to 5, which created a menu of options, which did well for the nonlinear strategy. And also, you could discard a card to re-roll any number of your dice. So the RNG of the cards impacted the RNG of the dice. If you drew bad cards, you could discard them to get bad dice rolls fixed, and that actually helped a lot. The reason I say Star Wars Destiny is like the future of card games is that there is a meaningful new genre of card games that is only starting to emerge and has been largely ignored, which is that instead of the format being you have cards in your deck that you play into an army, the format of I have heroes in play and I play cards that support them. Star Wars Destiny, you would play with like Darth Vader on the battlefield and like, a stormtrooper or something beside him, or you would play like Luke and Leia, that sort of thing, and then they could tap and attack the other characters on the board, and the cards like interacted with them and supported them. It was a bit too much, and the turns took a bit too long, and the base level game, the starter set, was terrible in many ways. It was very simple, but it didn't show why the game was awesome. And the game had a lot of awesome pieces to it. This Transformers trading card game by Wizards of the Coast took the same core ideas, but stripped them down to like their essentials. And I would love to see the Transformers card game, someone do something based off of that, but just a bit more. Add some more escalation in, add some more stuff. Oh, fun fact. The way that those games get escalation is they play upgrades on their characters. So the characters get bigger and bigger over the type of the game because they're getting more like weapons or enchantments, that sort of thing. Transformers TCG is brilliant. Wildly overlooked. Genius game. People should make games based off of it. All right, so next one. Play more simplified Netrunner, and it's quite hard to cut out a lot of those rules. Yep, yes it is. It's real hard. I've thought about it a lot. I don't have a solution yet. The problem is that any game where you're dealing with face-down information is inherently a lot to ask for players. If you could get rid of the face-down aspect of Netrunner for the ice breaking, it would help a lot, probably. Or if you could simplify it so you didn't have to do math in your head against face-down cards. The math of Netrunner is what kills it for most people. If you don't have to calculate exactly, it takes 17 credits to get through an entire ice layer, it would be a big deal. A lot of new players see 3 levels of ice in front of something and they assume they can never hack it, but in reality they can and they should. Netrunner is beautiful, so good, brilliant art too. When it's working well, it is some of the most fun you can have. When it's working poorly, it is immensely frustrating. Thing I would change about Netrunner, by the way, is it's so frustrating to try to get points as Netrunner, and it takes so long. You're basically constantly getting random cards and hoping that you get points by finding something just luckily. I would change it so that every time you get a successful hack, you get like points for every card you access, and you get bonus points if you find the agendas. That makes it feel so much better. Often RNG works best when it's guaranteed good thing, possibility of a bonus awesome thing. That tends to be when RNG works best. You get the satisfying good thing and the possibility of something wonderful. If it's just something great or nothing, you wasted your resources. That is often very painful and very niche. All right, sort of a meta criticism. Slides with white backgrounds are hard on the eyes. Okay, sure. That is true. That is a real thing. Anyway, let's go into other questions. Running into a piece of ice of the core of the game in Netrunner. Well, if it is, then I would cut out almost everything else and see if that's fun as its core. A really good thing to say is like, what is the most fun part of the game? Make everything about that. And because face down ice is so, if that is the key thing you think is the most fun, try a version of it, since you said you were interested in trying to look at Netrunner, that is just that, and with nothing else. What would that look like? Like, cut everything else out except for that. If that is really the most fun part of the game for you, try that, see where it takes you, and make something that is too simple except for that. And because it is so complicated to teach players how to calculate the types of ice they should be worried about face down, that is a really big thing. A possibility you could maybe run into as well is that maybe you could have it so that players can spend resources to look at face down ice, so that new players can do that instead. But good players just get to get skills by predicting the ice. And that way you could play it for optimally the way you wanted, but other players wouldn't. But really, always try starting with the core that makes it really fun, explore cutting everything else, see if that works. And if not, why not? Then just add those pieces. Often designing a game that is too simple and adding the places that fit to make it fix it once you discover what those are in playtesting is so, so, so much more effective. So, thank you. Thanks. A lot of people are saying, thanks, good talk, gotta run. Of course you do. It's been a while, but thank you. I really enjoyed this. So let's see. Hero-based mechanics becoming popular these days. Oh, question. There are a number of card battlers that have expanded on the Magic formula by incorporating range space, just like Dimensions, Faeria, Duelist, Elder Scrolls Legends. For context, that one uses 2 lanes, so it's like 2 battlefields instead of 1 battlefield. Otherwise, it's very similar to Hearthstone. It has an additional comeback mechanic, and whenever you take damage past a certain threshold, you draw a card, which was interesting. But yeah, it also breaks it into a piece, and then cards with a K. Don't know that one. I should look into it. The additional constraint adds a new dimension to combat tactics, but it can also limit how many options in your hand are relevant at a given moment. How often does this tension come up in Faeria's design? It seems like Charge is a response to this tension. Very, very little. In fact, we found that basically the ability to not care about a board game, care about a space, ended up being extremely valuable, and the ability to avoid enemy positioning ended up being one of the only elements you had if your opponent started getting board advantage. If you put Faeria's economy into a game like Hearthstone where you can't avoid your opponent's creatures, it would just break. Like the ability to avoid a creature that's bigger than you and gain extra resources on parity was the reason Faeria worked. the fact that Faeria made so many cards in your hand options at any given moment is probably a major reason why this wasn't a problem. Because the fact that all the cards in your hand could always be playable meant that you didn't have to run into a situation where you have a combat trick, say, on turn 3, and it's your only combat trick, and that's going to be the only thing you can use. Also, we made sure that events, like spells, almost never were based on the board. This is interesting. A lot of people assumed that we should do cards like Volcano, destroy a mountain, deal 4 damage to everything nearby it, and that's cool. The mountain erupts. It's fun. I designed that card early on in playtesting, and we cut it. A lot of cards that cared about only local effects, like choose a mountain and deal everything damage next to it, or when this creature is summoned, damage everything near it. There was a few of those that worked well, but largely it just meant that if it was friendly oriented, like you buffed your own characters, it kind of created this frustrating thing where you had to clump characters together. And if it was enemy characters, they just learned that they got really scared to go near your lands, which slowed the game down. And we were trying to not slow the game down. We were trying to push it forward. If we had escalation in the game that was pushing them forward anyway, that might have not been a problem. So largely events and effects like that stopped caring about local stuff, and adding charge to creatures allowed us to create a nice middle ground where things we wanted to impact more on the board could, but were still localized to a reasonable thing. You could still stay away from it. If everything in the game had charge 5 and flying, the game would not work. Only one card got to do that, and it was incredibly frustrating to play against. But that was their tool, and it made that deck really unique. Let's see, another question. On games that try to emulate fighting games, Yomi, BattleCon, etc., how's your perception of the translation, and do you think the mechanical depth of fighting games worked on the card game genre, both digital and physical? A game that does this really well is actually, that almost nobody knows, is called Star Wars Epic Duels. There are great mods for it on Tabletop Simulator. It's almost impossible to get in print now. It's basically a wonderful, super simple game, great party game. I used to play it all the time with people at school. It is basically this type of fighting game where you play cards face down and your opponent chooses defenses based on what they think you're playing. And unlike a lot of the other fighting games, it is very easy to wrap your head around when you're in danger and when you aren't. Anything that's focused on blind decision making is all about prediction, so the game has to be much simpler by comparison. I don't think that those games emulate the fun, the exhilarated thrill of fighting games very well at all. They're very cerebral. They're very guessy. I think a better theme would often be something like a spell duel between wizards, or like spy versus spy, or masterminds trying to outsmart each other. The frenetic explosion of the fighting games, like I get that it's all about shield versus grab versus hit, that sort of thing in fighting games, but the thrill and exhilarating experience of that is often like not the core feel of those types of card games. I think those games can be really fun. I often think they are way too complicated. They ask the player to know the opponent's deck really deeply and to make all those decisions face down. Similar problem to Netrunner. We have to understand all the types of ice your opponent can have, the types of cards you need to bake it, and the math you need to do against their barrier strength to break through. Star Wars Epic Duels, though, works really, really well because it uses it basically has very simple attacks. It is hugely powerful, impactful things. More of the cards can be played face up and do cool stuff that way. And it feels less cerebral and more just smashy. Even then, though, it's not a fighting game. It's more of a cinematic representation of Jedi duels, which often feel more samurai-like and disciplined, despite how fast they go. So I think that it works better. I do like the gameplay of those games. They're really cool, but there's actually stuff I wish they would do more of, which is setting up more obvious face-up tells to their opponent about what you want to do next. A card I've seen used sometimes is something that says, after you play this card, the next card, all cards you play on your next turn are going to do like extra damage. And so your opponent, or going to do double damage is actually better, double damage. So your opponent says, oh shit, like it's all going to do double damage next turn, or the first attack is, I better play my best defense card. And because they know what you want to play your big attack next turn, but they know that, you might play a middle card that says, oh, don't do much damage unless they block, and then I do lots of damage, or I do damage equal to the strength of their defense card, the defense card they played. And so that type of additional face-up information to help shape the mind game is incredibly valuable, and I would love to see more of it. All right, I think we're almost out of questions. I'll jump back to the person who asked like 6 and answer another one. Is it bad to have arbitrary cutoff for games, 10 turns? It's not bad. It's just that you risk ending your game in a whimper instead of an explosion. good stories don't just like end; they often build to a climax. So good games often force a big climax to happen, where you draw a last big card that ends the game in a big explosion. And your opponent gets one chance to try to like play a card, defend against it, and if they don't have it, you win. So arbitrary cutoffs like 10 turns can encourage players to play super defensively and do like chip points or victory mechanics. But I've designed, and they can also make it so that games sort of bleed out. A lot of PvP games, if you watch, for example, this great talk that Bungie did at GDC on designing the Gambit mode, that was a point-based game, so they were collecting points over the course of the match, and then the game would just kind of end, and it wasn't that exciting. So what they added was this giant boss that spawned that you had to fight. And so that way you at least ended fighting a giant boss together in a big explosive climax. This is also why games like not Pandemic, but a lot of the games that Matt Leacock made after Pandemic have a section where you have to do a bunch of stuff on the map, like find all the parts to a flying machine in Forbidden Desert, or find the artifacts in Forbidden Island. But then there's a rising action at the end where you have to get back to the like place you got on the island with, or to get to the flying machine, and then fly off and escape. So there's this last tense climactic race that he puts in the game to create this big focus moment where it's not just continue doing the thing you've done the whole game. So arbitrary cutoffs like 10 turns work really well in some games. They do not when they solve a specific problem, but try to make sure you have a climax in some other fashion. Let's see. Alternate win conditions enjoyable for a broad audience? Yes, they are. The reason that most TCG games tend to focus, as you're asking, on the idea of killing or beating down your opponent using health pools is because all the cards can work towards the same thing. There's a problem in Dungeons and Dragons design where save ends effects are really good against bosses, and so they gave these save ends effects are often stuff like if this spell hits, you're paralyzed, you can't do anything. And that's fine against when you're fighting 5 orcs, you paralyze one of them. But fighting one big dragon, if you paralyze it, the enemy doesn't get to do anything, and the structure of fun is destroyed. So what they did was they added this thing called legendary resistance to a lot of boss monsters, which means they get to ignore the first 3 save ends conditions that are thrown at them. This is almost a great solution. I actually think it is a great solution because it just solved their problem. And it said, guys, you can use this against bosses, but maybe you shouldn't. And it made their life much easier. If I was doing it though, with the benefit of 5 years of 5th edition, more at this point, it's like 7, right? But the point is, this is a lot of playtesting, so I have an advantage here. If I was looking at it now, I would instead do something like legendary resistance means you can ignore save ends effects, but you have to pay a certain amount of life to do it. Like you can take 20 damage or you can be stunned, and that way if the boss has only 20 health left, then they're going to be stunned because they only have a certain amount of health left. And they're not going to choose to die. On the other hand, this means that if they take damage earlier in the fight by choosing to take 20 damage instead of being stunned, then the fighters can actively help the save ends spellcasters. The problem is that it has like 2 hit points. You want to either throw as many save ends effects as you can at them, or save or suck, they're sometimes called, or save or die, save or suck, or you want to throw none of them and just focus on damage. Because if you only throw 2, they'll just ignore both of them. So by tying the save ends back to damage, ultimately you end up making all your resources drive towards the same thing. And this is why most TCG games tend to focus on the idea of killing or beating down your opponent with health pools, because all your cards can ultimately be turned into damage in some fashion. Some things give you resources can be turned into cards can be turned into damage. Some things can give you combat tricks, etc. Also, things that involve creatures fighting each other are inherently interactive. Like you are interacting with your opponent's cards or creatures in some way. You don't need to do it this way, and a lot of great games do have alternate win conditions as cards worked in. Magic has lots of them. They're very popular. But also, I think a game that I would love to see is Killer Queen. Killer Queen, the arcade edition, not really the Switch edition, but I think the mechanics are similar, is unbelievable game. Just utterly fantastic. And it has 3 win conditions. You can either focus on getting an economic win condition, getting 10 points, or you could like victory points, or you can focus on killing your opponent's queen 3 times, or you can focus on progressing this snail from it's like a payload thing in Overwatch, pushing the snail to the other end of the map. If you get the snail to the other end of the map, you get to get a victory as well. So your opponents are constantly choosing you're playing 5 players versus 5 players. It's like a miniature MOBA. what resource do we want to focus on? Oh my God, the opponents are suddenly really close are really pushing the snail really far. We got to think about the snail. But if we do that, that means the opponents can kill our queen more easily, maybe. Or if we're doing that, that means maybe they start focusing on resources. Great example of nonlinear strategy, super fun. I would build the game with that in mind. If you have completely parallel nonlinear strategies that don't affect each other, though, you run into an issue. And so what Killer Queen does is it very much says that only one person can be on the snail at a time, but other people can be protecting them. However, if your warriors are protecting them, they're not protecting your queen as much. And if your queen, who's a powerful fighter, has to go around and touch gates to turn those gates into advantages. And so to let you get your workers into you're upgraded. So your queen, however, is also the most powerful fighter on your team, so she could be trying to kill the other queen who is also doing that. And so there is a lot of depth into how each of these resources systems can be pushed in different directions. And a lot of really good games explore these types of aspects. Often, though, many games don't make purely different resources win conditions, though it is a possibility. They often more effectively start there, and then they decide to do something like, okay, these are my different objectives, but could I turn my objectives back into my main resource? And that way, all of these things influence each other more fluidly. Like Faeria, for example, had, if you look at the early alpha builds, had gold mines instead of had Faeria wells, but it had another resource called gold. That was the main resource for playing cards. That meant that some decks cared about Faeria, like going to the side of the wells, and some didn't. They only used gold. Rush decks built strategies that were just using gold. That way, they didn't need to go to the sides of the map. However, we switched this to make that everything just Faeria and not use gold. This meant that rush decks sometimes wanted to go to the edge of the map. Sometimes their rush would burn out and they would have to try to pace on economy. Or they would realize their opponent's rush deck was even more aggressive, and so they would try to play defensively instead. This created a lot more options. And because Faeria ultimately turned into resources, and resources ultimately turned into damage, that ended up driving towards a single win condition and tying all the systems together. So that's why people often don't do it. But that doesn't mean you can't. There are great games where you can. You just need to understand why focusing on only one win condition at the expense of everything else is a bad idea. Games with drafting opponents often do this really well. One of the best two-player games in the world, also card game based, possibly my favorite pick for any two-player game ever, at least within this rough format, is Seven Wonders Duel. Not Seven Wonders, Seven Wonders Duel. A lot of the ideas are the same, but the core gameplay is very different. Seven Wonders Duel has 3 win conditions: the science victory, which almost never happens, but sometimes can; the military condition, which happens sometimes, and it has the victory point condition, which is the defining one. The military win condition, however, if you don't manage to get a win on military, you don't manage to push them the military all the way to the end of the victory condition, you get extra victory points just by pushing it some of the way. So the military victory condition always ties to the main win condition of victory points. But if they ignore it entirely, you can actually just get a full win with it. And that's a really good way of having these systems talk to each other. Ultimately, different strategies that talk to each other and can influence each other is one of the major ideas of nonlinear strategy. All right, that was a really long answer, but really, really intensive thing. Is there a market for collaborative CCG games? Yes, there is. Most people focus on PvP because it's just what most games have done. There is a huge market for collaborative card games, but most people don't make it because the major games that were successful haven't done it. It's just that example. Fantasy Flight Games has had a very successful series of cooperative card games. Lord of the Rings was one of the first. The Pathfinder had their Pathfinder Adventure card game. Then there's also like Eldritch Horror came out a while ago. The LCG, not the board game, that did well. I'm pretty sure. I don't know the numbers or anything. Certainly made a splash. There's been a lot of them. Cooperative card games can totally work. I think Marvel Heroes is cooperative too. I'd have to double check. The new one from Fantasy Flight that came out like a year ago. They're very, very popular. Card games are not one format. They are just a very strong method for getting different options every single turn. Very good at giving you variance and opportunities. And cooperative games, more than PvP games, are more oriented around RNG. Pandemic is so much more RNG oriented than any competitive board game usually is. That's played seriously at that level because it's a cooperative game against the AI, so you don't mind when the game screws you over because you're trying to kind of beat the game. So that actually works very well psychologically. The only reason is that most people have ignored them, and actually I think cooperative card games are much better than PvP for an indie to make, because especially if you're trying to go video games, trying to make a digital matchmaking system as an indie, you have to build a big player base. If people start quitting, then the match times get longer, matchmaking ranks get more extreme, people have worse experiences, so they quit. It's a death spiral. If your game can be played solo or with 2 players or 3 players or 4, you don't need a tournament scene, you don't need a big player base, you can just have fun. This is why games like Slay the Spire have done so much better for indies, because they are PvE driven. All right. If you like TCGs with multiple orthogonal paths to victory, Legend of the Five Rings is an interesting case study. Yes. Legend of the Five Rings is an interesting case study. I remember someone was sat down to teach the game with me. We cleared 2 hours to do it, and we got through a turn. It was great, whole turn. One of the big, I would say, things about Fantasy Flight games as well is they often have great ideas, but they go insane into complexity. Now, one of the things about card games is that a lot of the most successful ones are more complex than other types of games because they are more like hobbies. You want the game to feel like it's bigger than the players, that they can't finish it, that there's always more to learn. But I think that it's very easy to create what I call a game that is interesting but not fun. A game that is an interesting puzzle is hard to understand. It's interesting to figure out, should I discard this card or should I play it? But fun is what you actually want to do. A good example of it is a Magic the Gathering mechanic. One of the most popular one is called Landfall, which is you get a bonus whenever you play a land. Now, the original mechanic for this was called Land Short, that they never released. This was internal. They talked about it later. Which is you get a bonus for not playing a land. You can play 1 land a turn usually, so that's kind of a resource. So you can expend your land drop to power up another card. This is a more interesting decision because you're interesting in that, should I play my land or not? That's an interesting decision. It's not fun. Players far preferred getting rewarded for playing their land that they wanted to do anyway and getting a bonus than being encouraged to not do the thing they wanted to do that made their game more fun and gave them more options. In fact, I actually think it's interesting that a lot of the most as players play Magic more, they tend to graduate to formats that, this is super, super simplistic, but they often graduate to formats, the most popular ones, that make the linear strategy aspect, or at least the options per turn, more effective by killing the mana curve. Commander doesn't really have a mana curve outside of the top competitive play. But even those, the mana curve is so short that most cards will cost 4 or less. So there's on your turn, if you have 3 1-cost cards in hand, you have an option all of a sudden. So that's awesome, right? Then that way you have your actual meaningful options, because the same thing with Legacy and Vintage. The mana curves are so low, the game's ends in so few turns, that you have a lot of options on what to do on every given turn. And often because of instance, you'll still play the same number of total cards over the game because the mana generation is so strong. The question is just what the order is, which options you play. It's compressed into fewer turns. Commander, often for casual play, which is the most popular format, just skips it entirely by making the game so inefficient at killing your opponents by doubling your life total to 40 and by making it 100 card singleton instead of 60 card with 4 copies each, that you basically slow the game down to an extent that you have time to get past mana problems, get up to a lot of lands, and often you ramp really hard, get up to 7 or 8 mana, have a bunch of cards in hand, and suddenly you have 7 cards in hand, all of them cost 4 to 7, and you have 7 lands, and you have a nonlinear situation, right? You have actually the options to now decide what to play with those things in hand. And also, one reason I think a lot of players love draft is that draft is very nonlinear. You are choosing which strategy to play while you're drafting. You open all these cards. Should you play aggro? Should you play control? Should you play combo? These are interesting questions. And you are building your strategy as you play with draft, and then mostly you play during the actual games to see how lucky you get and whether you can pilot your deck effectively. So draft formats end up also being more nonlinear. I think it's very interesting to see how the games often evolve. People's favorite formats tend to be ones that address a lot of the issues with the mana curve. All right. I think that is a lot. Can we have non-digital talks? Awesome. Can we have more tabletop talks too? I would love to see more of these. I'm sure there's a lot of great people that have them. And I think that often the best ways to learn game design is to start with analog. Because if you are building a digital game, it will take you months and months and months to get to a good prototype that you can actually start iterating on. And then iterations take a long time. If you want to start learning game design or just getting better at it, that's why I do side projects on tabletop and card games and board games all the time and role-playing games. Because I can, in 3 hours, And I have multiple times, like, build an entirely new card game or board game or role-playing game in a 3-hour game jam with some friends, and then we can playtest it that day. And then if you want to start making games better, grab some classic games, grab Catan, grab Monopoly, grab Risk, and ask yourself, how can we make this game better? If you're a game design student listening to this talk, please do this, because 99% of games, especially if you're hired as an associate designer, are how do I make an existing game better? How do I make more content for an existing game? Not what game should I make at its core. Either way, testing, fast iteration time and playtesting is great. In college, I used to make a new game in a week with some friends, playtest it on the weekend. Then we would iterate and change bits of the playtest, then we playtest it again on the next weekend, and then we would make a whole new game in a whole new genre. That was probably the biggest thing that helped me learn fast at the start. So yes, this is the game design series is 100% true. Excellent. Make board games, make card games. Also learn computer science if you're going to digital, but don't try to get good at game design through that. It is just takes too long. Also, things like Tabletop Simulator are amazing. You can create and upload cards so effectively, so fast. You can grab components from every board game in existence and make your own mods. You can build amazing games off Tabletop Simulator. I often do that when I'm jamming on card games or board games. And you can play test it with people all over the world. All right. Well, we've gone like for 2 hours now, so I think that is enough. I have been Dan Felder. You can find me at my blog at danfelder.net. It has a bunch of old articles on it, and every now and then I post new ones. You can, if you're interested in just me talking in general, I have a podcast called The GM's Guide, which is all about applying narrative design concepts and game design concepts, whether level design, combat design, system design, etc., to role-playing games. It is aimed at, because I think that dungeon masters are basically game designers mixed with DJs, and I very much love running tabletop role-playing games. If you're interested, if you check out the GM's Guide, I'd highly recommend checking out the most recent episodes, because I did a series on building your own role-playing game system and how I approach game design through that lens. Other than that, I'm in this Discord group. Feel free to message me and chat about stuff. Later, guys.